We've been covering St. Augustine, and there are a couple other things I want to say today about St. Augustine, and today we're going to turn to St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, Augustine's conversion is actually a moral conversion and not an intellectual conversion. So it's the famous Tolle Lege scene. It takes place in a garden in Milan. Okay, and I just wanted to make a couple comments about it. I won't read it. I just want to make a couple comments about the nature of his conversion. Augustine's mind has been convinced that Christianity is the best explanation for the nature of the world around him for quite some time by the time he reaches the Tolle Lege scene. But he becomes convinced morally when he reads Romans 12, 1 and 2, and decides that yes, indeed, he is willing to sacrifice the lifestyle that he had been living and to give up especially his sexual escapades, which he rightly, I think, believed he needed to give up in order to become a genuine Christian. I have some differences with Augustine, but I really respect that part about him. I respect the way that he gets it. He seems to realize that Christianity requires lifestyle change, and that's something that a lot of people don't seem to get. They seem to think it's just intellectual assent to certain doctrines. And Augustine realizes that in order to become a Christian, he's got to actually alter his lifestyle in a way that's uncomfortable for him. And I respect his willingness to do that a whole lot. Augustine, in the succeeding books of the Confessions, books 9 and 10, especially book 10, talks about some important issues with regard to the topic of God's relationship to temporality. So that's going to be my wrap-up topic today, God and time. Okay, it's an interesting assessment that he offers there because it actually sets the tone for many hundreds and even thousands of years following Augustine for the relationship between God and time. So it's a fundamental paradox if you believe, as classical theists believe, that God is eternal. If God is eternal and God has created time, how does God interact with time? How is it possible for God to insert himself in the affairs of human beings, for instance, and interact with us as temporal creatures? And for Augustine, the explanation is that God is outside of time. That is, God is not subject to time's constraints. At least this is Augustine's explanation. No one obviously knows the answer to these kinds of questions, but it is an interesting explanation that he offers that has been very influential for a long period. So imagine God standing there. This is a metaphor to help us figure this out. And imagine a train track here and a train going down the tracks in this direction. Now we, as temporally bounded creatures on Augustine's view, are on the train subject to the constraints of time. We cannot go back in time. Okay, and actually, if you think, just step back from Augustine for a minute. So, we often think about time travel or imagine it in films. But if you think about it, right, if time travel could occur, why hasn't anyone from the future visited us? It's something to think about. I'm kind of skeptical about its possibilities. I'm also kind of skeptical about the existence of other kinds of science fiction things like aliens, etc. Because again, we haven't been visited yet. But we can chat about stuff like that when we get to speculative time later. So the train of time is heading in this direction. God is outside of time, and God can see every different aspect of the train tracks simultaneously, because God is not subject to time. And according to Augustine, God can insert himself into different aspects of the train tracks. whenever he pleases because he's not subject to the constraints of time. How can God simultaneously be a temporally bounded agent? Like, you have to believe if Jesus of Nazareth is indeed divine, and also at the same time atemporal, that is not subject to the constraints of time, which is the view that makes most sense of a variety of different key classical theist doctrines. Augustine thinks that that part is a mystery, but somehow he thinks that God is able to insert himself into human affairs and cause himself for a time to be subject to temporality, even as he is also simultaneously not subject to it, as God the Father. Okay, it's kind of a difficult, mysterious sort of a thing. Augustine isn't really sure how it takes place. Is that a hand?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
I thought you were asking a question, but it could be either one or two ways. One, because he's omnipotent. He's so powerful he can overcome the shackles of time. Or the other thing is he's omnipresent. He's present anywhere and everywhere.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think that's the explanation would have to include some reference to those characteristics. There are also other views of the relationship between God and time, which are not Augustine's view. One view that's become popular in the last few decades, which makes sense of certain classical doctrines, but raises other problems with other such doctrines, is open theism, which says that God is actually subject to time just like we are. It's just that God has been around for all time since the beginning of time. But on open theism, God might not know the details of the future, even as he does know the general outline of the future. Okay, obviously these are really speculative kinds of questions, and nobody knows for sure what the answer is here. But not every view of God and time in the Western theistic tradition holds, like Augustine does, that God is outside of time and can simultaneously interact with all different aspects of time. And this is an example of a view that's not that. But this view, the view of Augustine's that God is outside of time, has been the most influential view by far, and continues to be the dominant view in the tradition. So he's been really influential in talking about issues of temporality. Okay, that's the last topic I want to do with Augustine. Are there any wrap-up questions on Augustine or on that topic? Everybody cool? Good. Let's go to Aquinas now. And if you'll look on Blackboard later today, I will be getting all the Aquinas reading uploaded there. It's not something that we're reading along for class, but it is something that it would be good for you guys to have exposure to. So I'll be uploading some materials to Blackboard for you guys to skim over, and that'll be testable material there. Let me talk a little bit about Aquinas' background. Aquinas lived many, many years after Augustine, about 800 years to be precise. And again, 800 years ago from us is 12th, 13th century, that sort of time. So you can see that this is a long period of time that's transpired. Some key events happen between the time of Augustine and the time of Aquinas that shape Aquinas' thinking. So Aquinas is Italian, and one key event that happens is the collapse of the Roman Empire, which had dominated Italy and also the whole of the Mediterranean basin, as well as the Near East and Northern Europe, Africa, Northern Africa, aspects of that as well. The collapse of the Roman Empire brought about, historically speaking, a decline in learning, a decline in transportation and technology. A lot of people in a lot of the world entered into a period known today as the Dark Ages, where libraries were not valued. In fact, the barbarians who brought about the collapse of Rome very much disliked book learning and destroyed libraries and all sorts of other valuable things that had arisen for a long period. And so by the time of Aquinas in 1225, when he comes on the scene, the world had changed a whole lot. And in fact, it had changed for the worse initially for a few hundred years, and then eventually it began to change for the better. Okay, and Aquinas was a key agent in bringing about the improvements in technologies and in thought and in conception of the world that brought about things like the Renaissance and the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Aquinas comes on the scene in 1225, but prior to him, a couple of key events happen. Okay, so for instance, here's one date that's really important, 1096. Does anybody know what happened during that year? Does anyone want to take a guess? I hope you guys know some of your history dates, yes? So like, I know for a lot of people history is just kind of a big soup. But, you know, if you have a few dates in mind, you can kind of understand when things took place. Like, what's that? Why is that important for us?
Independence of America.
Yay, thank you. Yeah. So I actually saw a video of this girl who went around at Texas Tech and interviewed the students there to see what they knew. And she was asking them really basic questions, like things like, when did America get its independence? And the students, just random students on the campus, they'd be like, 1974? No, and when she looks skeptical, they'll say, no, 1474. They have like no idea. It's like clear they're just totally guessing. Yeah, anyway, like if you look at the stats, most Americans can't place the century in which the American Civil War took place. All sorts of other things like that. Okay, but if you know a few historical dates, it can be really valuable in helping you conceive of just, you know, where we've come from and where things have arisen from. This is important in history because this is the date of the First Crusade. 1096 is the date of the First Crusade. And the Crusades were a period in the history of Christianity that I would say was not an especially constructive period. The Crusaders became infamous for a variety of destructive acts, sacking cities and killing a lot of innocents. But I should say in their defense, if it is a defense, much of the rest of the world was that way at that time anyway. So it wasn't as though the Muslims they were fighting against were necessarily any better. Basically, everybody was really brutal and things were quite violent. The world was a very different place at the time. At any rate, that date is important for our understanding of Aquinas because when the Crusaders set out to reconquer the Holy Land and retake it from the Muslims in order especially to take the city of Jerusalem, what they did was they encountered Islamic scholars, and those Islamic scholars had preserved and protected the writings of Aristotle. Okay, so the Crusades brought Aristotle back to Europe, among other things. They brought Aristotle back to Europe, and what had been lost during the Dark Ages was retrieved. And by the time Aquinas comes on the scene, this is beginning to develop much more fully. And Aquinas is famous in the tradition because Aquinas spends his life connecting Aristotelian metaphysics, so Aristotle's basic conception of how the world functions at its joints, what its basic components are. Aquinas connects Aristotelian metaphysics with Christian theology. So he explains mysteries like the incarnation, the atonement, Christian salvation, the Trinitarian conception of God. He explains these things in terms of Aristotelian metaphysics, using the concepts retrieved from the works of Aristotle brought back to Europe by the Crusaders. Okay, so when you think of Aquinas, He is a brilliant, brilliant thinker, but he's not necessarily a really original thinker. He is primarily important because he synthesizes Aristotle and Christianity. Okay, his life was lived out in a large canvas. He, like I said, was Italian, born into a noble family in Italy. At the time, there was no separation of church and state. And so a career in the church was often a way for families to obtain political power, and that's what his family intended for him. They intended that he advance in the church and thus obtain for the family certain political powers. Okay, and this would arrive for his family when he turned 16 because he encountered, during his time in the church, he encountered an order within the church that really impressed him. It was the Dominican order. The Dominican order in the Catholic Church is an order of preachers who are dedicated to scholarship and to help for the impoverished. And Aquinas was really impressed by this and decided that he wanted to dedicate his own life to helping the impoverished and also to scholarship. And so he announced this to his family. Okay, and this is when he was 16 years old. He announced it to his family, and his family kind of went ape. They were sort of the tiger parents of the day, I guess. And so they locked him in a tower in a castle, the famous Castle Gandolfo, where he was kept for a year. And as the story goes, they kept him there to make him try to relent so that he would return to his career of political advancement in the church rather than trying to become a mendicant preacher who would help the impoverished and dedicate himself to scholarship. But he refused, and so they tried various methods. At one point, apparently, even sending in a prostitute to tempt him. And as the story goes, he chased the prostitute out with an iron poker. Okay. Now, the story of Aquinas is really legendary. Okay, and I've shared this in class a little bit already. His scholarly feats were extraordinary. This is a man who would regularly, apparently, dictate to scribes in 5 different languages, all the while thumbing through the pages of a book and reading to himself. He wrote, on average, every day of his adult life, 1,100 words of incredibly dense philosophical prose. Okay, his influence has been incalculably vast. To this day, he is the primary thinker in the Roman Catholic tradition. Okay, so when you think of Aquinas, think the Roman Catholic tradition in Christianity. Not all aspects of Catholicism, of course, can be referenced to Aquinas, but his is the intellectual backbone for much, if not most, of the Catholic Church today. Okay, and he's also exerted extraordinary influence on Protestantism as well. I want to talk a little bit today about his arguments for God's existence, which are among his most famous contributions. In this class, we can only cover like the bare surface of Aquinas' ideas, but we can explore a little bit. Are there any questions or comments about his background before we look at the first argument? Everybody good? Let's look at the cosmological argument for God's existence, which is perhaps the most straightforward argument. It's the argument that's the most intuitive, the one that's easiest to grasp. And it's really easy, right? So let me just draw a quick diagram up here. Imagine that each of these letters corresponds to things in the world that have a causal relationship to each other. So for instance, let's say that's me. And that's my parents who brought me about. I mean, I don't know my origin story exactly. Who wants to know their origin story? Who knows back of a car? Who knows? Okay, And there's their parents who brought them about, okay? And their parents and so on, okay? And you can do this sequence for any one of a number of different things, right? The tree comes from the acorn, which comes from the tree. The grain of sand that you find on the beach comes from a rock which has been pounded down by the ocean, which comes from lava, which comes from inside the earth, right? You can find the origins of anything by tracing them back through a causal chain. And Aquinas says the reality when you inspect anything in the world is that it has origins that can be traced back causally. He calls it movement. And he says that everything is moved by something else, okay, or caused by something else, brought about by something else. Everything is moved by something else. And there are two possibilities, he says. Either we go back in time all the way to a first mover, a first cause, an unmoved mover, a prima mobile in Latin. He writes in Latin. A first mover, or we go back in time all the way to infinity. There is no first thing. There's no first mover. There are just different intermediate movers all the way back. There are really only these two options, he says. Okay, and he thinks that the answer here is that this has to be the correct explanation for how things have come about. He doesn't think that you can go back to infinity. Okay, infinity is really hard for us to wrap our minds around. Every time you come to a cause, it had another cause. Every time you come to that other cause, it had another cause. Okay, and we're so temporally bounded as creatures, it's really hard for us to wrap our minds around the concept of infinity. Aquinas thinks, though, that infinity can't be the answer, because if you think of this set, and it is, suppose it were, in fact, an infinite set, then what you would get is a set made up of intermediate movers or finite things. So a set made out of its contradictories. Each one of these participants in the set is an intermediate mover. This is moved by that, and in turn moves that. This moved by that, and in turn moves that. And you would get a set going to infinity made up of finite things. In other words, a set made up of its opposites, which he thinks is a contradiction. Okay, now, it's kind of abstract metaphysics, and, we could spend some time covering the objections. The point is just that for Aquinas, there needed to be a first thing. There had to be a first thing. And that first thing is not necessarily a personal God. That first thing is just some first mover. It might be a deistic origin. It might be a divine figure who has no interest in the world that he created. Aquinas says the argument doesn't tell us what's the correct explanation here. It simply leads us to the natural intuition that some first thing existed. Okay, and he thinks that he can dispel with objections that maybe things went on to infinity by virtue of the contradictions that unfold from that. Okay, now this is the first of 5 arguments for God's existence that Aquinas offers in the Summa. Summa Theologiae is his most famous work, the Sum of Theology in English. This is the first of 5 arguments for God's existence. We're going to cover 2 others in this class. One today and maybe another one today, but more likely one on Wednesday. Are there any comments or reflections on this first intuitive, easy argument, the cosmological argument? Everybody kind of follow the nature of the argument? There had to be a first thing, is what he says. Okay. All right, now a much harder argument is the teleological argument. And I'm going to actually go through a PowerPoint to explain this one, because it might be a little more intelligible if we cover it in the form of a PowerPoint based on contemporary physics. The teleological argument is known as an argument from design. Okay, telos, the Greek word telos, literally just means goal or ends. An activity that is teleological is goal or end oriented. This is an activity that is aimed at some purpose. And the teleological argument stipulates that when we look out into the universe and reflect on it, it quickly becomes evident that there is some goal or end, there's some purpose built into it. Okay, and the universe is constructed